Okay, I'm here for another episode of Reflections, and I am here with DaHanG, who is a long-time Quake player. He's actually not just a duelist. He did play CTF, played TDM, etc. But he is more recently known perhaps to people from Overwatch, where he was playing with TeamLiquid, and now back to Quake again because we've got Quake Champions has come out. He's competing in that at the time. But as with, I think, almost everyone in Quake, I think everyone's kind of figuring out where that's going. No one's quite certain, how many years it'll be. So everyone's kind of just dipped their foot in the water and we're all seeing how it's going. So obviously, we're going to start, as you'd expect, way back in time because, what's funny is, to me, you're not an old school gamer because I only heard about you in Quake 4, but that actually makes you a pretty old school gamer now, mate. That's like a decade ago. So one of the interesting details I do remember is that when Quake 4 came along, I knew pretty much all the people on the circuit because these were all people who played Quake 3 most famously, and a couple of people, maybe the odd person who came from Painkiller or something. But one of the interesting details was, for the people who don't know the chronology of the games, Quake 3 basically took over from Quake 2 in terms of the esports side of things, actually almost immediately, because I think Quake 2 came out in something like, I think it came out very quickly after Quake. It was maybe 98 or maybe 97. So it was only a year or so before Quake 3. Remember back then, games were made for single player purposes. So you'd buy one each year, you'd make another game a couple of years later, because that's how you make your money. So the point I'm getting at here is, when Quake 4 comes along, the reason why we know everyone who's competing in it is because Quake 3 has been the esports game for a solid, we're talking 6-7 games before in terms of Quake. And actually Quake 2 as an esports game only was the big game, the big duel game for maybe a year and a half. I remember that period of time. And because of that, we had a very brief period that anyone was known from Quake 2. But I remember when Quake 4 started, and you were one of the names that came along that people wasn't familiar with actually. And that was kind of a new person breaking onto the scene and having results. Mm-hmm. Everyone said, oh, well, actually, that's because DaHanG comes from Quake 2. And that was the game he was playing before this. And you were one of those weird people, right? Who, even though Quake 3 existed and was even an esports game, you were just playing Quake 2 for fun. And as another detail for people who are outsiders to all of this, NA Quake and Quake World, their scenes were considered almost dead. It was basically just a small group of people, some small cops online, and sort of mainly a community of people who all knew each other, right? So were you just playing casually in Quake 2 before Quake 4? Was it just for fun or something?
Yeah, it really was. I started playing back in 2001 in Quake 2, and I played on and off for a while, and then I got back into it because I started with 56K, and I was like, okay, this is fun, but everyone's beating me with low ping, so I basically quit. And then I got a DSL modem back in '03 or something, and I resumed playing, and I loved it. Was really TDM that I was playing all the time. And so, I just focused on that, casually, you could say, but I was, getting a lot better. And I didn't get into Quake 3. It was really, I don't know if it was because Quake. I don't know if it's kind of a mixture. Quake 2 was kind of my first love of Quake, you get set with it. Particularly the movement system I really liked. And then when I tried Quake 3, the movement system was it was a little dumbed down because you couldn't do all these fancy double jumps. And that was one of the primary things I really enjoyed in Quake 2 was the trick jumping. So I basically stuck with it, and I didn't really think about esports really at all. And then, in the Quake 2 servers, I remember everyone's like, oh, Quake 4 is coming out. So I'm like, all right, maybe I'll keep my eye on that. But in the meantime, I'm going to stick with Quake 2.
Okay. So on one hand, right, I don't blame you because as I referenced when I was talking about Quake there, even when Quake took over as the big esport, for anyone who knows the chronology of it, unfortunately, it was only the number one esport for, again, maybe a year or two, because actually then Counter-Strike took over, and Counter-Strike in terms of the West especially, we're ignoring Korea and stuff like that, was kind of the big game that was at the big tournaments. So even when I say you didn't compete in Quake 3, that's not as unreasonable as it sounds, because Quake 3 itself a couple of years in was already kind of relegated to kind of like what Quake is now, where it exists, it has tournaments, but you've got a smaller pool of people playing it, and it's not going to be number one. And at the time, the expectation isn't that it'll be ever number one again. So generally, if you look at the people who are competing in Quake for a long period, that we've even up to when we're going to talk about now, it is the same group of people, because here's the thing, they know they're so good at Quake that for them, it's not diminishing returns. They can win a tournament, they can win money, and they're good enough already. But you didn't get as many new people coming through the door. So I realized, especially in North America, there weren't many tournaments left. There was QuakeCon and stuff like that, Did you ever have any interest in Quake 3 when it was an esport? Did you ever follow it or watch any of the players? Were you interested in esports at that time?
I was not, actually. So I'm taking a trip down memory lane. Back in like 03, 04, I didn't even know esports was a thing. Because all I just hopped into servers.
Yeah.
I didn't really visit community websites. I didn't really get on, back then it was IRC. I didn't do a whole lot of interacting. So it's basically what the talk of the town in the servers was
Yes.
what I paid attention to. And a lot of these were just diehard Quake 2 players. They were also not going into Quake 3. So yeah, that's what I was alluding to earlier. When people started, I didn't even know about Quake 4 coming out until people told me in the servers, hey, this is coming out. So I was just in the dark. I didn't know really anything about Quake 3. I mean, I knew about the game, but not the esports perspective of it.
Yeah. So actually, one interesting detail about how Quake 2 worked was it makes sense how you described it there, because actually what people would do was they would just have all the servers bookmarked of the servers they know, like the ones close to them, the people that are good, and you would just join it and you'd see, is it free for a duel? Do I have to wait half an hour for it to finish? We didn't have server browsers back then, and there wasn't obviously any sort of a matchmaking system. That was light years away,
Right.
So during this era, though, I realized Quake 2 it wasn't really so much esports back then. It was competitive because people played, and people either played, some people get competitive even just in dual servers, but there might be some odd online cops. Were you ever interacting with that side of things? Did you just connect to servers and play whoever was there, or were you ever playing any of the competitive side of things?
I really wasn't doing the cups or anything. I think I may have maybe at the tail end in 2005 before Quake 4 came out. I may have been participating in some TDM things and some dual things, but I had all these servers bookmarked like you're describing. I remember specifically the most popular one in North America was Assassin's GX mod. Okay. So some people might remember that. And basically I'd refresh my browser, boom, I'd see 14 of 16 people in the server go and just TDM it all day. So
when you played Quake, one of the interesting things is actually TDM's one of the modes in Quake 2 that got the least fame at all, because it basically almost had practically no lands. Again, Duel really took over Quake generally for the esports side of things. Sure. But I know that actually in the history of all the Quake games, people who've played all the games actually talk a lot of shit on Quake 2 TDM, because they always say that one element of it that I don't know what rule set you use, but one element that people always used to shock shit about was the fact that you could drop the weapons and the ammo. So it's not just that you have to control it and then let your teammate get there and get a weapon or something, but you can sort of give him ammo and a weapon, right? Did they still use that in TDM? What did you think of TDM in Quake 2? Now you've played other games. Was it actually a good mode?
I think it was a great mode. I think that feature of dropping weapons and ammo to your teammates was actually one of the core things that made it more enjoyable, because in Quake 3, you started out with the machine gun, which was it was fairly useful. In Quake 2, you started with the blaster, which was pretty worthless. It did 15 damage, and it was a slow projectile. So and weapon respawns were 30 seconds. It hasn't been like that for so long. I think some people tend to forget weapon respawn time. So it was just so important to be able to drop weapons and ammo to your teammates. And sometimes it's if your teammate has a rocket launcher, you may have incidentally picked up rocket ammo, and you can just give them the ammo specifically. So there's a little meta game to it, actually. And I thought that was a really interesting element to team deathmatch in Quake. I really enjoyed that aspect of it.
Okay. So when we came to the world of Quake 4, you actually weren't one of the guys who immediately appeared. When the first tournaments were happening, people forget the first big Quake 4 tournament was actually at the end of 2005. It was CPL Winter or something like that. It was actually, funnily enough, Cooler won it, I think over Toxic. So you know how things changed after that. So Then we had 2006, where obviously that's when toxjq emerged. He was winning pretty much every single tournament, and at the time, everyone was like, "No one's ever going to beat this guy or stop him." And I remember 2007, which was kind of like the last big year of Quake, was when I remember you really coming on the scene and having your results and getting like a bunch of top placings. You know, having some top fours, some third places. I think you had one towards the end where you got a second place. When you came into that scene, as you're saying, you weren't involved in esports really before that. Did you really just play Quake 4 and then just casually encounter the esports side of things? How do you go from being someone who just plays the game to like literally attending the LANs?
Yeah, well, when Quake 4 came out, there was definitely a lot of talk, in the community about there's going to be big tournaments and things like that. So that did interest me as I got into the game. But there was the GGL AmeriCup 2, I think it was, where they had a big 4-on-4 TDM tournament. So that was what my focus was on for like when the game came out up until like a couple months into 2006 was the whole TDM side of things. So Duel again never really interested me. TDM I always found more enjoyable, so that was it. And then when I started hearing about the one-on-one events, I'd look at the like prize payouts and things like that, and it was like a lot of the time, except I think like Winter CPL and like another CPL event paid pretty deeply, but a lot of the time it was just top 3. And my own buddy Scooby from Black Dragons, he was like a pretty good dueler in North America. I think he got like 3rd or 4th in that AmeriCup thing on the North American side of things. And I remember he was
the guy who was like Polish and then moved to America or something, right? And played in Quake 2 as well, yeah? Okay.
Yeah, he was pretty much a legend in Quake 2 TDM. But yeah, I mean, he was beating me regularly in Duel, and not that I like took Duel super seriously or anything, but like it just wasn't inspiring to do that, and I was enjoying TDM. So,
wait a minute. So did the fact that he was beating you make you think, "Oh, I'm just not good at Duel," but he was actually a really good player or something?
No. Like I knew I could if I like buckled down and like tried really hard. Like I knew I could probably do a lot better, but it just. Thinking about it from like you're an unsponsored player, you really haven't been to any events. They're paying out to top 3, and even 3rd place only gets like $1,500. Like for a lot of the events, it just wasn't appealing to me. Particularly in 2006. So
what's the turning point then? How do you suddenly enter the scene?
So there was a GGL Digital Life tournament toward like I think it was fall 2006.
It was in New York, right?
Yeah, and I think like 4 North Americans were going to be able to qualify or something like that. And so I was like, if you qualify, they pay for all your travel and so forth. So I'm like, well, it's free. Let me give it a shot. So I did. And I attended that event. I qualified, attended the event. I got 7th or 7/8, top 8. So it wasn't like a great performance, but that kind of like led me to think I'm approaching the top. You could kind of say like they're not so out of reach, the top players. So I said to myself kind of after that event, I'm like, well, if the next year, the next circuit of tournaments reappears, and Quake is still a thing, I'm going to give this a shot. So I would say the GGL Digital Life was kind of the turning point where I decided Duel is a thing that I can definitely go for.
Okay. So does that mean that if you had have not qualified for that LAN, maybe there is no Duel career?
Probably not, because when it comes to like, I probably would have gotten into it. Because when I'm thinking about like gaming in general, like I never play any other games. Like
you just pick one and you just go right at that.
Yeah, it was just Quake. So for the longest time, it was Quake, whatever Quake is. And since I basically knew, like I was like, a top player in general when it comes to just movement and aim and timing and things like that, I knew I had the skill set. It's just a matter of getting the reps in and, learning the dual game type at a higher level.
So, okay, when Quake 4 was around and they had this big circuit where people were playing all these matches, I have to say, of all the Quake games I've ever watched Duel, like maybe this is just a naive layman, but it felt like Quake 4 was one where I felt like it was a little bit more limited than the other Quakes. Like it didn't feel like you had as many kind of flamboyant styles that were so radically different as in being able to have a very different style, but also be very good and potentially win the tournament. You know, like a lot of the people who are the best players, like that actually to me did seem like the version of Quake where it was the best aimers were a lot of the people who are winning. You know,
Right.
I mean, I don't think that's a coincidence why toxjq dominated so much. You know, Avec and Cypher rise up. You know, like is that too simplistic? What was Quake 4 Duel like, do you think, contrasted against other Quake games you played?
I mean, I can kind of agree and disagree. I think Quake 4, you do kind of have to play a certain style a little bit. I'll give it that compared to QuakeLive, for example. QuakeLive, you can play a lot of plus back, timing items and running, and that's because you can't really get ambushed the same way that you can get ambushed with the crouch slide speed from Quake 4. So in Quake 4, if you don't contest a red armor and you just keep running, like over time you will get punished in a stronger fashion than in QuakeLive. In QuakeLive, you're still going to get punished for ignoring big items as well, but in Quake 4, it's like I think you're going to get punished for that lack of map control, that lack of engagement. You can't just run. So I think from that perspective, like you're forced into this style a little bit more than QuakeLive, because in QuakeLive, there's so many more bottlenecks and chokes, and the rocket bouncing. The way you can play defensively in QuakeLive allows for a little more liberty and a little more individual style to maybe appear to the viewer.
Okay.
That's kind of my take. I'm not sure if that really makes a whole lot of sense.
Okay,
but,
no, I get it. Okay, so you referenced the crouch sliding there, which obviously became the core dynamic of Quake 4. And I remember actually that in the early versions of Quake 4, that basically didn't exist. Like I believe it actually came in, it came in off a patch or something like that, right? Because that's the thing people always said about Quake 4 is like maybe if they could have had it how it was at the end, like out of the box, people feel like it would have been a lot more popular, right? Because I remember when it first started, it was pretty slow and there was a lot of issues with it.
I think that's correct. I think crouch sliding, I think it came out and crouch sliding was a thing, but no one really understood it and how to like use it for like a number of months. So I think maybe I'd have to look at the VODs. That's an interesting question about the Winter CPL, the first event. Yeah. I'm not sure how heavily utilized crouch sliding was, but I also do remember some later patches where they like actually made the ability to extend the crouch slide farther. That came into play. So like it definitely began to play a bigger and bigger role as time went on.
I mean, if you liked Quake 2 and you like double jumping, presumably you enjoyed the slide mechanic, right? You thought it was a good addition?
Yeah, I liked it because like I said, like just to try to put in like a simple scenario, let's say I got 100 health, 100 armor, and the enemy has 100 health. That enemy with 100 health in Quake 4 might even have like a superior position to me, but because I'm overstacked, I can maybe rush him and kind of punish him due to the stack advantage. There's like a higher likelihood of doing that. Whereas in QuakeLive, if you have 100 health, 100 armor, you can't really just rush that guy with 100 health who also has superior positioning. Yeah. So that's just to really oversimplify it. I'm not saying that in Quake 4, just because you have a bigger stack, that means you rush, but you have that liberty to do that. And because of the crouch sliding, like, again, it's less obvious that you're going to get ambushed because it happens so fast. Whereas in QuakeLive, like, you can kind of see it coming.
Okay. So did you actually think you integrated fully into Quake 4 as a duel game? Did you figure out a good style? Did it get kind of consistent and effective? How did you approach Quake 4?
Well, I was never really a big aim player. I mean, I've always had like good aim, but just the timing and map control and the positioning around the items due to the timing was always my strength. So I mean, like I remember pouncing on items at the exact second, and a lot of the times if you catch your opponent like just waiting on a red armor and it's up in 3 seconds and they're just waiting, those 3 seconds are kind of an eternity. So like I could just come crouch slide in and place a perfect rocket and then pounce on it at the same time, things like that. Those were the kind of ways I would kind of develop a style, I guess you could say, is just playing so item oriented and positioning around the items rather than just raw aim and battle skills.
Okay. So one of the people, and when I went back and I looked over some of the results and I was refreshing my memory a little bit, one of the people I've noticed in Quake 4 that you actually met in a whole bunch of tournaments, which, like, if this was a movie, this is exactly how they'd bill it, right? You have to, the people you're going to meet late in the movie, you obviously have to meet early on and have encounters with, and it kind of introduces the character. Because I noticed in Quake 4, you actually played Cypher quite a lot. When you consider that, he wasn't actually like one of the biggest names early on. He's somebody who also came along. I mean, I think he was like 15 years old when he started, He came along like halfway into Quake 4, and then actually in the first tournaments, he kind of like cycled up. And eventually, by the time you actually were getting your best places, is when he was making finals and stuff, What was Cypher like in Quake 4? Because obviously, spoiler for anyone, he's going to come up again later in the interview because you kind of played him all the time in Quake 3 as well. So what was he like in Quake 4, though?
The one thing I really remember the most about him in Quake 4 was his rockets just being so on point. Because in Quake 4, I think to people that maybe followed the scene but didn't follow it super, super closely, they just think of toxjq and his lightning gun,
yes.
And rightfully so. But with Cypher, his rockets were pretty insane, and rockets in that game were not easy because, or
a bit
as
slower,
easy.
right?
Yes, they were slower. They were faster than Quake 2's. I think they were the Quake 3 speed, but not 100%, but pretty similar. But QuakeLive, the rockets were actually a bit faster.
Okay.
So, but Quake 4, like he'd be in these spots where like, he might be pretty vulnerable, and his only out is hitting 2 perfect rockets. And I just remember he had like really good placement. Like, I'm not talking about like flick air rockets, but just the placement, and there was like a methodical approach to it. That's really what stood out to me the most when it came to Cypher, is just his particularly in Quake 4, his rockets were always on point.
Okay. And towards the end of Quake, what's actually kind of cool about your run, I noticed in Quake 4, is you really did kind of power up, You started just getting gradually better and better placings, and then right towards the end of Quake 4, people might remember, like, that WSVG Toronto was pretty much one of the last tournaments, because unfortunately, like, right after that, I mean, sadly, a lot of people didn't get paid, but they kind of just killed that whole tour right after that. I think they had the finals, and that was it, right? So people might remember in that tournament, you beat Cypher, you beat Cooler, these were like the big names at the time, and you got to play toxjq in a final.
Right.
Now, listen, almost everyone lost to toxjq in finals. Almost everyone lost to toxjq in Quake 4. Right. Could you have beaten him? Was he beatable in Quake 4? What was he sense?
Yeah, at that point in time, he was definitely beatable. I actually beat him. I had to come from the lower bracket at that tournament, and I beat him the first set of 3. And then I lost the second set of 3. So it was like, it really was neck and neck at that point. And I honestly think my style kind of threw him off a little bit, but I mean, he's still toxic. He's still like the Quake 4
why do you think,
god.
like, what do you think disrupted him about it?
I remember setting a couple traps and just things that, like, I would just bounce him with a rocket and like get a really clean kill when you really shouldn't. Like, I just remember having a couple of those moments. And I think he's used to just coming in and trampling over people, but like, I was kind of ready for it. So I think it kind of threw him off a bit. He may have had to adjust his style against me a little bit, and just be a little more cautious, I guess you could say.
Whenever anyone has like absurdly good aim, like obviously toxjq, that's a primary quality of his. It is very easy to just be like, oh, it's just skill, they just outskill everyone, But obviously, especially, I mean, this from QuakeLive, there were some people in QuakeLive who were fantastically skilled, who didn't win almost any tournaments at all. They'd go out in like the semis or the quarterfinal every time. I'm thinking of like Sparty, Kilson, some of these guys had absurd railguns, but they didn't win many tournaments because they didn't have the other elements of the game. So what was toxjq actually like in terms of style of play?
Well, I'm trying to just think back. I just remember it's kind of like, you can never really fight LG versus LG when you're even stacked. You have to always respect that. And you always had to play like corners with rockets. I mean, you can't play afraid though. Like if you got a bigger stack, you still got to take the LG on LG fight if that's what it's going to come to. He really wasn't a timing player, like someone that timed the items too heavily. It looked like he was, but he had the I mean, he had timing, just not to the second too reliably. Okay. But you can kind of play
He's
by
like an
feel.
intuition player, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. But his positioning was also very strong too. So like he would kind of like, he might not. Let's just take for example, Red's coming up at the 27-second mark. He might be there at like the 22-second mark, but he's still scoping you out. He's ready for you. Like you can't come get it, basically. So you can kind of play by feel more in Quake 4, I think, actually, than in any other Quake when it comes to the timing of items, particularly because the battling plays such a larger role. So yeah, I just remember some of his ambush plays, his fearlessness, and his movement. Not just his aim, but his movement was just really, really strong.
So when I was looking through some of the old results, and I'm mainly just looking for like who the last opponent you lost to, or who the big names were. And one little detail I noticed, was from a WSVG tournament in 2007. It was from Dallas, because the official story goes, DaHanG, that like rapha only started in Quake 3. He started in like 2008 when he was like the rookie, and he gradually became very good. And here's the thing: I remember him referencing a long time ago in an interview that he'd gone to like some lands before that, I think with his dad or something. But I noticed he was at this tournament, and you beat him actually apparently early on in the tournament. So for us in Europe, we didn't know rapha basically until he became very good. Was he already around in the scene? Were you aware of him at the time?
I didn't know him until that year, 2007. So, he was just a new kid to me. I mean, I was kind of a new kid on the scene as well. But yeah, he was playing Quake 4, and he did it for kind of like the love of Quake. I remember. Okay. Like he knew he had a big upwards climb, particularly in Quake 4, which really didn't really fit his style, particularly at the time. I'm sure. Well,
like you said, you can't really play plus back, right? So you can't have the kind of clever defensive moves he would try and play.
Sure. Like I mean, if a game like Quake 4 launched today, I'm sure he'd be able to adapt, particularly with all the experience under his belt. But like that particular point in time, it definitely didn't suit his style, even though I noticed he was improving. But he was, he was kind of in that whatever, I don't know what he placed, maybe 9th through 16th or something like that is my guess. But he was, he had a long way to go. It wasn't going to be like in 2 months he was a top 3 placement. Like he was, if Quake 4 continued, he may have reached the top or, but I just remember at the particular point in time, he was not quite where we think of rapha today.
Okay. So I remember in Quake 4, like the trend, because as we've referenced here, rapha was there, but essentially there's a reason why no one remembers from that time, because you didn't have the top placings. So in terms of the NA players, because this was a game heavily dominated by European players, I mean, you think of Quake 4, you think toxjq, Sturmy, Cooler, Cypher, Avec, Fox, it's all Europeans until you get down there. So there was a little crew of NA players who were good NA players, but I noticed they all had like a different factor that was like an offset. So for example, Socrates, I mean, he's actually called Socrates in that game. He was around a bit still, he's obviously a legendary Quake 3 player. I remember you had the young guy Chance, who was like a guy who was trying to, he had his own charm to him, but he also seemed like a player who just always lost like the big clutch match, he never really could often beat the big Europeans. And then in terms of you were the guy where you were the complete, no one knew you. You just came into the game, and as I said, towards the end, you kind of rose through the ranks. Were you really driven in Quake 4? Were you just still playing for fun and seeing how it went?
That particular time, yes, because that WSVG circuit, World Series of Video Games, was pretty much all during summer of 2007, between semesters. So I made a conscious effort so I didn't take any classes, and that was it. I was just going to play Quake. So no summer job, nothing. So that's really, I got to owe a lot of the success to, that dedication of time and effort to it. If I was just carrying along, I don't think I would have kind of came out of nowhere, so to speak, and had good placements. But yeah, at that particular point in time, I was like, I want to see how far I can take this, essentially.
I also, just to finish up the Quake 2 segment, I remember that was the year where they had the weirdest QuakeCon ever, where QuakeCon for that one was all the different versions of Quake. And you just like, it's almost, you did like a pick ban or something, right? And then you just played 2 or 3 of them, however many you needed for the map. And so the most bizarre thing about it was, the reason why it's the weirdest version of Quake ever is because, first of all, there's almost no really great Quake duelist who played all 4 versions of Quake. So everyone was basically trying to be like, oh, you're a player from Quake 3, right? Well, I'm going to try and win Quake World against you, and maybe Quake 2, and then, oh, maybe you win Quake 3 and Quake 4. You know, it was like, it really was this mad setup like that. But I noticed in the results, right, that unless they've mistakenly put the wrong result down, did you actually beat PURRI in Quake 2?
Yeah, I did. It was
because for anyone who doesn't know, PURRI, that is his game. He played some Quake 4, but this is like a legendary Quake 2 player. That must have been pretty cool, right?
No, it was. It was awesome. Like I pretty much knew I could do it. I didn't. The thing is in North America in Quake, particularly Quake 2, like there is no PURRI to practice against, so you don't really know what you're getting into.
Yeah, you don't know how good you are, right?
I wouldn't. I was kind of going into it like, just play your best. Whatever happens, happens. Like, would I have been surprised if he beat me? No. Would I be surprised if he beat me bad? Still, probably not. You know, Quake 2 is quite a bit different of a duel game. Yes. So, particularly the way spawn fragging, you can kind of run away with it because you can just rail someone off the spawn and boom, they're dead. So,
and you can hear where they spawn on the map and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
right?
The sound system, for those that don't know, in Quake 2, you can hear sounds all over the map, which I actually like because you know, you're gaining information.
Yes.
So, and because you know the movement is so fast, you can still constantly react to the sounds. But, anyways, yeah, I remember playing him. It was the Rage was the map, ZTN2 DM3, and it was like neck and neck, kind of, for the first half of it, and then I basically ran away with it. I remember getting like 3 or 4 big spawn kills at the end that just clinched it, essentially. So,
so when like for people who don't know the chronology, when like the circuit basically died because of WSVG dying in Quake 4. Then we had this really weird transition period where they did still have Quake tournaments the next year, but like everyone went back to Quake 3 vaguely. And then what happened is in 2009, out came QuakeLive, which basically was obviously like a reworked version of Quake 3. Now, did you actually try to play Quake 3 at all? What did you do after Quake 4 kind of died out?
After Quake 4 died, I mean, I basically just stopped gaming. I played a little bit of Quake 2 for fun, but when I saw, there were like a number of factors that made me not want to play Quake 3, which was like, one, I never really loved it's just, first you're going from Quake 4, which I really enjoyed that movement system much more than the base Q3 style. Then the prize pools, again, weren't like spectacular on that ESWC circuit. Then I saw the map pool, which just did it for me. Like every single map was a 10-year-old map. And I'm just please no, I'm just not going to bother. And, you know, and not because I didn't think I could do it. It was almost like out of principle. It's like if we're not playing new maps and we're going to play 10-year-old maps, like all 5 of them, you know, I'll let the Quake players have their fun, but I'll be on the sidelines, I guess. Waiting for the next game and whatever.
So then maybe you've alluded to an obvious reason as to why QuakeLive would draw you in. First of all, obviously it had a real circuit, you know, like we knew from day one there's going to be the IEMs and stuff, you know, it was bigger than what, like Quake 3 really was a stopgap, you know, they had a couple of games where like, ESWC did it and maybe DreamHack or something, I'm not sure, but it wasn't a big circuit. Okay, so we had a big circuit, but as you referenced there, another key element was we had new dual maps. We had T7, we had T9, you know. Yeah, it's true. We did still have DM6 and ETN. It was some of the ridiculously old ones. Was that a factor to coming into it? Was there anything else? Do you actually think QuakeLive was different enough for you?
It was a little bit different enough. The rockets felt different. Like it just had a different feel than Quake 3. Like if you, I can't really put my finger on it, but if you jump around, shoot around in Quake 3 and then jump around, shoot around in QuakeLive, they feel a little different. Like it's subtle, but it's different. But when QuakeCon announced in 2009 that they're going to have a CTF tournament, I was like, well, hey, that's, to me at the time, I was thinking that's legitimately fun. Sounds like an awesome tournament. Like I want to go ahead and try and compete in that. So that's how I was basically getting like my aim and movement in QuakeLive, because if you've never even played Quake 3, even though I played Quake 4, like I didn't feel that comfortable compared. Like I remember just not being up to par from an aim and movement perspective when I started playing that game. But QuakeLive CTF sounded like a lot of fun, and Duel was kind of like, at the time, it was like a secondary note. Like, obviously I said, like, I'm going to compete in the Duel tournament at QuakeCon. Like, why wouldn't I? Because I'm there. But yeah, it was really the CTF that drew me in.
Okay, I noticed you had a bunch of CTF tournaments you played in. You won a bunch of the QuakeCons. Right, here's the question. I have to ask this in like typical Thorin style, right? Which is like obviously semi-obnoxious. So
Sure.
when I see that you've won all these QuakeCons in CTF, obviously my first reaction is like, wow, I didn't even know you were that good at CTF. You know, it's obviously a very different type of mode. Like for people who don't know, people who play Quake don't tend to be good at Duel and TDM or CTF. It tends to be like you're one or the other. You're a team player or you're a really good duelist. And then I looked at who you played with, and you did play with some people who were like, they were just like I think that ID guy, wasn't he just like all CTF? Wasn't he just playing like non-stop in like every big team? How good actually were you at CTF? Like what type of role did you play?
I was like kind of you could almost think of it as like the flex role, but on the offensive side. So I was the guy that was making life miserable for the enemy flag defense by timing their items and just fragging. Whereas ID was the typical flag runner, but it doesn't mean that I don't run the flag, you know, but that was kind of the on paper role that I played.
Obviously it never was a massive esport. Like it was mainly just these QuakeCons.
Right.
People often sometimes speculated because, like I referenced before, Quake's day in the sun, as it were, as the #1 game was like we're talking about like it ended in the early 2000s. You know, by this point in time, it's a niche game with its own interest, but it's a side game. It's never going to be bigger than Counter-Strike or League of Legends at this point in time. You know,
right?
So people often speculated maybe that Duel was the wrong mode to go with. Maybe if they'd have done something like CTF, because people tried to rationalize that, you know, the flag's a bit like having like the ball in American football, you know, so you can watch some of the matchups in American football, but you largely watch where the ball goes, you know. There's a logical way to tell the story. Was CTF actually, like, could it have been just viable as if it had been the main esports mode in Quake? What do you think?
I mean, it probably, just to kind of be frank, it probably wasn't going to be which game type was the main tournament game type that was going to be the driving decision. I think going back, like the way Quake 4 was launched was just pretty abysmal, and like it was so buggy. They made it as a single player game. Multiplayer was like a secondary thought, and then like we kind of like forced it into the multiplayer scene, even though the game wasn't really up to par yet.
Yes.
So like I think a lot of people were kind of turned off by their initial Quake 4 gaming experiences. And then like, so a lot of those, you know, potential arena FPS deathmatch players went to play Counter-Strike or even WoW, like whatever other game there is. And then similar to QuakeLive, you know, I just remember a lot of things turned off a lot of players initially. You know, there were way less maps, way less content, way less control that a player has. Like I'm talking like the first year or so that it came out, no matchmaking, no, you know, you can't like launch a server. You don't really have admin control over servers. So a lot of the times, like you're joining a game trying to play duels, and like someone just takes the slot and you won't spectate. Like this was stuff that people struggled with. So I think there were a lot of more infrastructure related issues that held QuakeLive back, because I think, you know, there's a window of opportunity where you kind of, you attract the player base and then you retain the player base. Yes. But if a lot of people are coming in, they're like, this is Quake 3 in a browser, and I don't see all my favorite CTF maps. I don't like, you know, there's just way less content. I think that, so I think like, and I'm not, you know, claiming to have like the answers or anything, but I just think, to me, Duel versus CTF is almost like an afterthought as to like, you know, what could have driven more success in terms of viewership numbers and things like that. I think, you know, it was way more going on kind of in the back end of things that people may not think about as much.
So since in QuakeLive, even though people might not realize this, because when like the scene had its big esports moment from when it first started, so we're talking like 2009 until basically around some point in 2011, because that was when at the end of the IM circuit they dropped it for that year. And listen, it still had DreamHacks for a couple of years, and it still had QuakeCon actually up until very recently. Even had it in like 2016. I think they had the Quake 3 one still, QuakeLive rather. And so it still had some life beyond when people remember. But the point I'm getting at is it did have a lot of tournaments. Like there were many, many tournaments. Like if I had to guess, you might have been to like 20 LANs in QuakeLive, maybe more even, you know. So obviously we're not going to run through all of them. So a way I thought we could tell the story is we'll pick out some of them where a key matchup was a specific player you played. I thought that would be a cooler way to do it, because that way you could kind of go through like the rivalry and see how it developed or what was tough about it. So as I referenced earlier, someone you played in Quake 4, one of your first tournaments in QuakeLive actually, when you were at the IEM Dubai tournament, the player you lost to in a close quarterfinal match was a young man from Belarus called Cypher, who obviously went on to be outrageously good. And two of the players we're going to talk about is going to be Cypher and Rapha. And I will just say, just as kind of, first of all, a spoiler and a disclaimer for people who don't know QuakeLive as in depth, right? If it sounds like DaHanG lost a lot of times to Rapha and Cypher and met them a lot of times, that's not that unusual, because they did, between the two of them, win nearly all the QuakeLive tournaments. And again, because they won nearly all the QuakeLive tournaments, it's not like DaHanG wasn't good because he didn't win. It was basically those two winning most of them. And put it this way, Cooler won like, I think, one tournament. Avec might have won like one or two tournaments. You know, the list of people who won tournaments were very little, because unfortunately these two players, with their own very different styles, beat everyone. So when we talk about Cypher in Quake Live, you referenced before his rockets, right? That's always been, even back in Quake 3, what was like, it's almost like absurd how better his rockets were than even like whoever the second best rocket player was. Because it sounds weird, because most games you can have a little edge on someone else who's a top pro, but like I always used to describe it like this. I might be exaggerating a little bit, but let's imagine, okay, some sort of in-game system that's a bit like how you would think in real life. So you look on the floor and you think, right, that's 5 meters in front of me. Okay, let's say most normal people, I'll give a random number, let's say most people's rocket damage area where they can, you know, reliably hit is 6 meters in front of them. Then Cypher's would just be like 8 meters. And so that's like, well, if you know anything about how like battleships work in World War II, if you can just park a mile away from his and yours shoot 2 miles further than his, you can kill him and he can't kill you. Was it as ridiculous as that when you tried to play against Cypher rockets in Quake Live?
Yeah, but it wasn't really even like, yes, but it was more his whole style in general too.
Okay.
Like, I'm thinking back again to that era you were alluding to, 2009 through 2011. Yes. In my opinion, and I mean, others may agree, he really didn't have a strong sense of timing, particularly to the second in that particular era.
I believe he just played off feel himself, because I think that's what he did in Quake 3.
Yeah, so but his positioning and the way he could dodge as well, and it's kind of like, too, so hitting rockets is almost everything in Quake Live, slight exaggeration, but it's not that he would hit like a big opening rocket. It's that he would finish you with a second and a third. And like, so it's like once he hits that first rocket, you're essentially dead and you're just trying to do damage while you're in the air getting bounced. Okay. Like he didn't really, his ability to not only just hit the first one, but to continue connecting, you know, like he instantly reacts very well. That was, you know, I don't think anyone's ever really done it quite like him in the history of Quake. But yeah, like, you know, there's sometimes like you're thinking he's so outstacked and he really hasn't been running the items too effectively. Yes. And so since you got an extra 100 armor or whatever it is, like this is your time to take advantage. And then all of a sudden he does like 200 damage uncontested on you and you're dead. So he was like the only player really in the history of Quake that could basically do that. And I don't want to say reliably, because like that makes it just sounds like no one could ever touch him and no one can frag him, which that's not the case. But no one did it nearly as frequently as him in the history of Quake.
Right. Interestingly enough, I'll contrast him against Rapha in this way. One of the things about Rapha is purely in a contextual, subjective sense, he didn't seem like an oppressive player skill-wise. Like it's not like when you play against like Avek's Plasma Gun or Cypher's Rockets, where you can see they're outrageously good, and in certain positions, you know, you will just be dead to rights if he gets you in that position. If you play against Rapha, most people know his strength is like strategy. It's like obviously a very clutch mindset. Right? Actually, Cypher, it always felt to me more like an up and down player. Like he could be incredibly hot and could be unplayable, but you could also catch him on days where he didn't win all the tournaments. Sometimes he would just lose and he would be beaten by people. when you actually played against him, what was the thought process on how to what are your win conditions when you play against him? How do you have to try and play him? What do you have to hope happens? Is he psychologically intimidating because of his skill? What's it like in that sense?
Against Cypher still, right?
Yeah.
I don't really think about that too much. Like just personally, like I'm always just thinking like I got to focus on timing, positioning, not really making mistakes.
You didn't game plan too much for people?
No, it's really because Quake is so dynamic. Like you can kind of know player tendencies.
Yeah.
But you can't game plan because the information is always changing in a duel game, and you have to react constantly. You can't think, okay, I said to myself, if he does this, I'm going to do this. Okay. You're just in this. It's almost like everything is automatic, all your decision making, because you've got all the reps in from practice, you've watched demos, things basically just happen. There's not even enough time to really think. But yeah, you got to basically try not to get too close to him, I guess you could say. Is something like you could look out for. If he's got rockets, like just keep cessing him, try to rail him, try to outspam him, keep the control up. Try not to also give him too much breathing room, because that's something like I've actually had, I've taken tournament matches from Cypher, and he can be overwhelmed. Like if you get that first frag or two and you got like full map control, he didn't have that ability that some others might be to like work their way back up. He likes playing that patient game where like, he's not in too bad of a situation. And I don't want to kind of ramble, but one of the things you need to do in Duel and QuakeLive, it may come to it, is you basically need to die in like a sacrificial way just to like, do some output of damage and work your way back into control. What I noticed, I'm thinking back to the era of 2009 through 2011, because I actually think Cypher's actually gotten a lot better. Okay. But back then, he didn't really have that mentality of like, okay, I'm down 6-0. There's only 3 minutes left. Like, I need to, I got an LG. Let me just go in and try to do as much damage as possible while dodging. He would always kind of wait and just keep waiting for those kind of almost dream situations. And then, so he's not really actively coming back the way maybe he should. He's always looking for that breathing room, that kind of like, okay, I got you locked in on my crosshair and I'm in a safe spot. Like now I'm taking the fight. Like he didn't really take too many uphill battle risks that I think maybe might have been expected in that particular game.
Okay. So a very memorable meeting between the two of you, I remember, because it was one of your first big finals in QuakeLive, was the 2010 DreamHack Winter. And this one has a very weird little story that leads into it, right? Because in the group stage of this tournament, I remember what happened is a whole bunch of what were the top players, because at the time we had kind of like a big four. It was like rapha, Cypher, Avec, Cooler. These were like the big four. You expected them to be in all the semi-finals, and they typically were. And then it was, which of the two will make the final. And I remember a few of these players bizarrely lost in the group stage in like the last match. And what everyone said was they were like, they're just trying to rig the bracket. Like, one of them didn't want to play, I don't know, Cypher or something. And what I remember was, because of that, I think DreamHack even reset the bracket or something. And when they did this, right, as a result, everyone's thinking, right, well, that's the only reason they lost any of these matches. But then you beat Cooler in the round of 8, you made it to the final, you played Cypher. Was this like a turning point for you? Because it's one of your first biggest runs, right? It was one where you weren't just like kind of a player who did well, but there was an also run. You were contending for the championship. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't remember the full story about the whole, like, because I can't verify it either. I remember hearing something about that, like potentially like losing to face different opponents. I can't verify any of that. But I didn't even like, because I was thinking back, preparing for the talk, like kind of like what may have happened at various events. I don't even remember that until you brought it up. So, but yeah, like I remember now that you mentioned that as well, that I think Cooler said something like, it's okay, I have a mid-tier player or something like that he plays or something like that.
By the way, for anyone who doesn't know, Cooler, First of all, like, I give him the benefit of the doubt. He's speaking English. He obviously comes from Russia. He never had the most amazing fluent English, but he could definitely speak English. But he also, it's not like that alone. Like, he didn't lack for words. He was a very flamboyant individual who had basically, unless you were in that top four we're talking about, he's definitely going to trash talk you, because he even used to trash talk those guys. So he definitely had I would say, an arrogance about him, right?
Yeah. I think what happened, he said something like that, and then I beat him, or maybe he even said that after. I don't remember.
Okay.
And then I think it was Kilson that I had to beat.
Yes.
I could be okay. Yeah,
Yes.
then I beat Kilson. So yeah, that was I think my first big run in QuakeLive, where, I had to beat some pretty darn good players, to make it to a final. Because I'm thinking back. A couple of those QuakeLive events, particularly in that time period, I was facing Rapha in like the quarter or something like that,
Classic matchup. Not for you, obviously, but for viewers, yes.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, and the final, I remember having a few bad rockets that sent myself into the lava on DM13, and but I was like still coming back, but it was just like too little, too late, and he barely won. So
at that point in time, like, it sounds from the way you describe your style and your mentality, it doesn't sound like you're a guy who gets too kind of affected by emotion. Actually, you sound like you're fairly quite a rational guy in terms of how you approach the game and how you're going to play the game. So were you someone who even used to think, for example, like, am I going to be one of the best in this game? Can I be one of the best? When you were in these, like, as you referenced before, in the other tournaments, you would get knocked out in the round of 8 or the round of 6 or whatever. Did that take its toll on you? Did you ever wonder, like, maybe QuakeLive's just not my game?
No. I mean, I just kept basically playing. Those kind of thoughts never really entered my mind. Like, all I ever think about is, like, if I'm going to compete in a tournament, then I want to do my best, and just focus on preparing as well as I can, and
Sure.
Whatever happens. And sometimes, like, I can remember IEM in North America, one of those, like, I had to switch mice because of the EG sponsorship.
Okay.
But I was doing my best to prepare, because this was after Dubai
Yes.
that I lost to Cypher and got
Yes.
top 8. So it's kind of like I went from like a 4th place finish to like an 8th, and then I'm thinking, like, I'm not sure where I'm going to come here, and I was actually down.
Right?
Yeah, I was down 0-2 as well, which was like,
Yes.
it was interesting because the day before I had beat Rapha in the group stages pretty handily.
Okay.
And then I remember, like, just playing in warm up before the match for us. I mean, I was like, wow, he's moving and shooting really well.
Yeah.
And I was down 0-2, but, like, it's just, you just keep playing. Like, what else can you do, really? Like, you can't really, and again, a game like Quake, like, you don't really have time. And I know your question was kind of alluding to maybe like outside of the game itself, but like in the game, it's like, things are just happening and you're just performing according to, your experience and your instincts. So there's no time to really think about anything else.
Okay. So you had also a couple of classic matches where you played Cypher, and unfortunately you always played him in the final. So you had a couple of QuakeCons where you made it to the final and played him there. Is it, I realise obviously we're going to talk about Rapha soon, and he obviously also had a lot of key wins over you, but aside from, was Cypher actually some sort of a nemesis for you, someone who just always seemed to be in your way? Was it is there some sort of style reason you think as to why he beat you?
No, I mean,
okay.
I don't think so.
Here's a side question to add. Okay, is there one of these that you should have won? Like you played and you were like, the match was close.
Yeah.
You really could have won this one.
I think 2012, that was basically mine. But then, because I was up 2-0, and on it was either the 3rd or 4th map on Furious Heights Tourney 7, I remember just missing a bunch of rails that he's basically giving me. Like,
Okay.
He's in a bad spot. The rails weren't easy. Like,
Sure.
They're vertical. I'm shooting down on him. But I had like 2 or 3 free shots. If I connected with like one of them, and it sounds kind of silly but I think a lot of Quake players can relate. Sometimes winning or losing the game literally comes down to one rail because of like a domino effect. And that one was basically mine, but I just missed the rails. So that one I kind of gave to him more than he earned. Like,
Sure.
So That's at least my perspective. But the other one in 2014, he was just like pretty much on fire. I was on like, I guess, my B+ game. See, now that I'm thinking about 2014, I think there was a practice game I actually played a player named Sparks, like warming up earlier that day. And I beat him handily on Aerowalk. And I remember seeing my rail percentage, and it was like 6% or something like that. And I'm just thinking, like, how can I be heading into a final and with 6% rail? Because against like Cypher, right? Yes. Against Cypher, it's like, I actually feel, my mentality was like, I can out control him, and I can afford. If I'm like negative 15% on the rail, give or take, like I'm still gonna have enough in my arsenal to overcome that and win. Right. But that particular 2014 final, like, he just outfought and outbattled me like pretty hands down. And I remember thinking, like, I need to basically work on my mechanics more than anything. Okay. That's all that really came down to in my mind. So,
okay. Does okay, so one thing you referenced there, where you kind of talked about his early style, and then you said like you thought he became much better. That's another element that's a bit weird for people, because obviously a lot of people only followed it during the IEM era, like the classic era, you know, with the big tournaments. But for people who don't know, so for most of the first part of that era, like Rapha was winning all the tournaments, and then Cypher started to come on strong, and it was kind of like a really good rivalry between the two, and then Cypher had a period where he was very good. But I remember towards the end, where kind of, I don't blame people for not being able to keep a track of it, it's when it became there was only like 2 tournaments a year, you know, and so you couldn't see people month to month. I remember actually that a bunch of people said that actually Cypher, it seemed like he got even better in that era. I mean, he actually won a lot of the tournaments that around that era. Like, if anyone ever goes and looks, most of the ones towards the end that Rapha won were like the years, for example, where like Cypher couldn't get a visa or just couldn't come to QuakeCon, you know. Like, sadly, that just is what it was sometimes. So what changed about his style later on?
So going back to 2009 and 11, his aim and movement was always insane. And his instinctive timing, not to the second, was still enough, because he would just thrash opponents with like 200 uncontested damage at various points. And then later on, I just noticed that his positioning, he was like always in the right place. So again, like, and this is a generalization, just to say 2000, 2011, like he's not in the right place. But I just remember he'd be in like these spots that are just not too beneficial for him to be like physically on the map. But then he'd overcome it with crazy aim and movement. Whereas later on, he was actually like really controlling items and in the right place at the right time, putting pressure on you, preventing you from getting items while hitting everything. So he was like, at least that's the way I feel like his gameplay evolved, was just kind of like I guess you could say the mental game of positioning on the map based on item timings and, you know, where to be in an opportunistic place to cut off the opponent as well. That's basically what elevated his game, because that's the way. And just anecdotally, like, you know, playing Rapha, you can kind of know where he's going to be, which there's nothing wrong with that when he's in the right place. But Cypher, you didn't really know where he was going to be a lot of the time, which is like a good and a bad thing. But then toward the end there was something about Cypher's play that was a little more suffocating, and like you felt a little more like, you know, like you really can't touch him on the map, because he's just gonna, you know, hit you with crazy rockets or just melt you down with LG, more than maybe Rapha would, for example.
Okay. Like, since he was the guy who in the big international tournaments, ignoring like those IEM America tournaments you referenced, in the big international tournaments, when you got your best runs and you made the final, it was always Cypher in your way. Did it actually bother you that you never won one of these big tournaments? I mean, like you said, like you picked a year, like maybe 2012 was the one you could have. Does it bother you? I mean, as you said, most of these players, you beat them in a group stage match at some point, or you beat them in other tournaments. So it's not as though you probably felt like you could never beat them. So does it get to you if you've lost a bunch of finals?
I mean, I don't really think about it too much anymore, but I mean, I just keep my head down and keep playing and keep competing. But yeah, it'd be really good and nice to at least have that one like big world championship under your belt, because then it's like you've got it, it's on the resume, and it can't be taken off. So it's more from like it'd be like, it wouldn't even, like, for example, if I win a big Quake Champions international tournament, I probably wouldn't even be so happy as I am like satisfied, you know? Like I want that under the belt and like a thing of the past. So then like, you know, it's just there. Like it doesn't really impact going forward how I'm going to approach a tournament or anything like that, but it's more like you just want that accomplishment there. So
because from knowing a lot of people in different esports games, and especially the 1v1 games, where obviously, you know, the burden's entirely on you. You can't blame a teammate or some, you know, I kicked off the right team, you know. In a 1v1 game, I have found as a general trend, if I had to generalize, people who've been in a lot of finals and didn't win, a lot of them, it does get to them. Like, for example, I kind of what you're referencing here, all of them say that pretty much. They all say, in a weird way, I'd rather give up all the second places, even if I had, like, some of them might have had, like, 5 or 6, you know, if it meant, like, for one tournament I won. I'd rather just been, like, you know, at least on that day I know I was the absolute best and forget all the others. Because what's weird is, as an outsider, you'd be like, no, obviously I'd choose to have the great career, you know, have lots of really good placings, be good over many, many years. You think to yourself that's what you want. But there is something that is a little bit fucks with you that you don't win the whole thing, right? You didn't ever go the whole way.
Right. Well, there's like 2 pieces of consolation that I can tell myself so I can sleep at night.
Okay.
Well, one is I did beat Rapha at the North American Championship.
Yes.
So that's like still a big accomplishment because it's not like I beat like insert other American player here. Like, if, for example, if I beat like CZM or 04 at that particular time, and Rapha just had a really bad tournament, it was like he got 4th or 5th for North Americans only, which would be very, very bad for his standards. But if it was something like that, then it wouldn't be as much of an accomplishment. But because it actually was Rapha, who's, you know, obviously a legend, like I do have that at least. And then the other piece of consolation is Quake Champions is here, so it's not
still
over
a chance.
yet.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, I like that mentality. Right, okay, so let's talk a bit about Rapha then. Since he's someone who was in the NA scene with you, and especially at the beginning of QuakeLive, he was the best player. He was winning all the tournaments in a row, and if not, like he actually, like I said, when not only was Cypher up and down in terms of personality, but his results could be a lot more up and down. Like there was tournaments where, I mean, he's gone out in the group stage before and early in tournaments, you know, whereas actually Rapha had like an unreal run of like, you know, even if he lost the tournament, he came top 4. It was like actually bonkers how consistent the guy was, which again, if you look at it, mentality, style of play, it tends to tie into that. So since he was ever present as this top figure, did you actually, what was your relationship like in those early years in QuakeLive? Like, were you just rivals? Did you ever, were you actually friends in any way? Were you practice partners ever?
I mean, we were always on good terms. He wasn't my number 1 practice partner. I used to play a lot of DKT and Chance and Sparks a lot more probably than him. But yeah, like every time there was like a big online cup or an actual tournament, we ended up colliding. And I did defeat him a number of times, but he did get the best of me more. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of the way it goes when, you know, the way it is in North American Quake. It was kind of like him and me, and then like a pretty decent tier drop off, you know, between like the next group of fellas that could really compete with us. Yeah.
So obviously, when, like, as I set up when I talked about Rapha contrasted against Cypher, he is someone where, I know for outsiders, a lot of them are very naive and they think Quake, right, high skilled game. I assume the people who win are just all the most skilled players. Like, I mean, I'm sure someone who doesn't know Quake thinks that the best rail player wins the game, even though, as I outlined before, no, that's not the case. I mean, yes, people like Cypher had absurdly good skills, but there was people who were as good as them with the rail who didn't win tournaments. But the reason why Rapha rather, his career almost did seem like a movie or something, is because I can't really think of any player who had anywhere close to that much success who, it's not that he wasn't skilled, he just wasn't like ridiculously good with many of the weapons. Like, what was his actual skill set like, do you think?
Well, I think his rockets were actually really, really strong. Like, I would probably rate his rockets second best in the world over Cypher.
What type though? Because wasn't he more like using the rocket as a defensive weapon almost, as opposed to, I mean, Cypher would be like an air rocket or something. You know, there's not many frag movie clips from Rapha, right?
Exactly. Well, that's the benefit of the QuakeLive style of game, is he would be at a lot of choke points in places where he could dish out damage, but really couldn't receive damage. So it's like, even if, you know, his opponent had map control at the moment, he could hit one good rocket, but then also be like on the run for the next big item and ready for it. So it was like, just by hitting that rocket, basically the tides have turned a little bit and he gained control. So it wasn't also like, it was just that his rockets were really, really good, which they were, but he also like knew how to react based on, okay, what am I doing next? What am I doing next?
Okay.
Like he was always in the right place at the right time, essentially.
But I mean, if you play against Rapha, you felt like you had a skill edge?
No, not necessarily. Like, I mean, on paper, I would say, so his rockets were definitely better than mine on paper. I'd say my LG was probably better. Rail, I might even give it to him. But it was more like his positioning with rockets that just really added, because you don't really, when you think of like positioning for lightning gun, like it's a straightforward fight. You're probably a little bit vulnerable to damage if you're doing LG damage. Whereas with rockets, you're not necessarily vulnerable to damage. So he would be in these spots all the time where, he could dish out rocket damage while receiving none. So it's like, if rockets are your best gun, particularly in QuakeLive, that's almost like having, like, let's say, put a fake artificial number on the value of the strength of weapons in QuakeLive. I'd say rockets is 10. So out of 10 is how important rockets are. Whereas I'd say LG and rail, I'd say like 8 out of 8 for both. So because rockets were his best gun, like it went a longer way. And obviously I'm just making that up, but that's the way I kind of feel about the game. And his timing was always really, really strong too. Like I was always very, very good at timing 2 items, but he would get into, and I would try to time 3 or more items depending. But he was always dishing out damage or in the right place based on timing. Because just because you know the timing of an item, even a yellow armor, doesn't mean you go and get it. So he might be up at the high ground dishing out rocket damage, and again getting ready for the red armor, and then you're on the bad side of the map now with limited health and resources because of his decision to go there at that particular time.
So because, and especially in those early days of QuakeLive where he did win so many tournaments, like his style was so distinctively different, it felt like to almost everyone else, because he had this very intelligent sort of way of, like I always described it as, it's like a lot of the really good Quake players, because they did have fantastic skill sets and they could literally win most fights if as long as it was above an even chance, and if you're a Cypher, maybe even a slightly lower one than a normal person, they can win most of those fights. So a lot of them had like a mentality of like, right, I'm going to find a fight, I'm going to take the fight, and if I win the fight, then I get the item, I kill the guy, that's how they play the game. But it always felt like when Rapha played, he would he'd set up that game plan, but then he'd also be like, but if the fight starts to go badly and I don't like this fight, I'm going to back off over this 50 health and go through this teleporter here and get the shards over this. Right. It's like he would go the extra step, because it's actually, it sounds counterintuitive, but there is a logic to it, because if you are Cypher, that probably is the way initially to win you're going to win this fight, and that's what you're thinking about. Then I'll decide what to do. Whereas in his situation, they're never thinking, well, what if I lose the fight? Because again, that's not the way they think about the game. So when I describe this style, this is mainly for the viewer, by the way. Obviously, you know all this shit. Like when I describe this style, though, it makes a lot of sense to me as to why it actually tilted so many people to play against Rapha. Because if Cypher just hits who knows what percentage LG on you and rails you all over the map and just flies around the corner, you feel like, right, okay, tip my hat, you win, you were better than me in this game. It's easy enough to accept that loss. But if you lose to Rapha, it kind of fucks with you a bit, right? Because his style of play it's infuriating, right?
I mean, I definitely can see that perspective.
Was it for you?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say I had more of a problem with Cypher's style of play, just because Rapha and our style, aside from the fact that I'd say his rockets are stronger, or is actually very similar. Like we really want to control the map, timing items, positioning, not really relying on aim. But I think his a lot of decisions that come down to like a 0.3 second window to like do the strafe jump in this direction based on the placement of an enemy rocket, things like that, or not jumping and just having like a weird circle movement. All these kind of like teeny little things probably go unnoticed to most people. But I think he had, when you add that up, like adding all these little mechanics and abilities to his arsenal, like it really adds up to just an overall complete game, that I'm probably lacking in a couple of those like small mechanical areas, you could say. But yeah, his style never really, because I liked the predictability of his style because we both know the timing of all the items. So like,
there's a logic to where he should be.
Right. And then it just basically comes down to execution. Whereas for someone like Cypher, it's like, I know the timings of things, but it almost doesn't necessarily even matter because, you know, he can just destroy with aim and movement. So that's more frustrating to me than just kind of being potentially straight up outplayed rather than out-aimed.
With that said, another quality of Rapha, which is an obvious one, is a pretty clutch player. I mean, in the big games and the big matches, he often seems to play better than he does in the group stage, etc. Now, in a lot of your matches, I can vividly remember some of them. Like, I think there was one where you played in like an ESWC in like a really close match. I definitely remember some of the IEM World Championships when you played him. In a lot of your games, as you say, because you had like some similarities in style, they would often be very close games. Like, no one was wrecking, like, it wasn't like Quake 2 where you just win 20-0 over the other guy and he can't get in the control at all. These were very close games. And so to an outsider who's not in the match, it is easy to just paint with a big brush and say, right, well, obviously Rapha was just more clutch and he just got the key kills. Within the game, did you ever have that feeling like he had some edge on you in that way or something? Or what was your sense for why he could get it over you in so many situations?
I just think it's just his quickness when it comes to like how to react in situations was just always so strong. Because you could just be left kind of like suffocated on a part of the map, but then he'll like leave you there while he goes and collects an item, and you're thinking like, why doesn't he come kill me?
Or something? Yeah.
And but then like there's kind of like a logic to it because maybe if he kills you, you respawn on the side of the map with the red armor, and then you're back to 200. So there's all these little like, there's just I think high level duel and like Rapha in particular, like just the quickness of decision making is like it just adds up. Like if you're think about, let's just say there's, I don't know, like making up a number again in the 10-minute QuakeLive match, for example, if there's like 100 quote decisions to be made, if you can make them all in 0.1 seconds versus 0.4 seconds, that's going to be good for you, right? So it's just his decision making was just up there, pretty tough to deal with.
So as you referenced before, one of the things that does make it difficult to game plan in QuakeLive is that essentially, like aside from some very simple concepts, as you said, like tendencies, like, you know, how someone might come for a red armor or what they do after they get killed and they have nothing, you know, aside from simple things like that, it's totally dynamic. You never know what positions you're both going to be on the map and what the score will be and therefore what you have to do. But with that said, did you ever study any of these people? Did you ever study Rapha or study Cypher and try and watch their games? Because I know, for example, that is something that Rapha says he did do, actually. He used to look at like cooler games and try and see if he could pick up a little edge or something. I know a lot of the European players like Cypher, Avix, I don't think they might have never watched a demo in their life, mate. Like they were ridiculous for that. Did you ever apply yourself in that way? Was there any benefit to it, do you think?
Yeah, but that's the thing is like when you're looking at the same players on the same maps for 5 years, you know, like you kind of know what's coming and you know their style and their tendencies. So like, yes, but you get to a point of diminishing returns where, because it's not like Overwatch or like some other game where the strategy can be changing just based on a patch, you know, or new maps coming out all the time, things like that. I mean, that's the era of QuakeLive is a lot of the same maps that are very old, and the players have been playing the game for over a decade. So outside of, you know, just initially understanding kind of like what the player style is, once you've kind of got that, you're not getting a ton of value. It's still valuable. But Quake compared to other games, there really isn't that strong of a need to study your opponent, at least as in depth, I would say, as many other games. Okay.
So I know towards the end in QuakeLive, you did have those, like, you had 2 QuakeCons where you beat Rapha in key positions. I mean, it sounds like an obvious question, but you have to ask stupid questions when you're interviewers sometimes. Was there a special satisfaction in overcoming him in big matches? Obviously, QuakeCon, obviously one of his home places, right? He's won many times.
Not really. Not because it was him in particular. Okay. Like I just want to advance.
Do you enjoy life, DaHanG? Sometimes it sounds like you don't mind if you lose. Yeah.
Everything has been just like, you know, get farther and farther. I don't really care is in my path. Right. You know, like
you're just competing against yourself.
Yeah, no, that's especially with Quake because it's not really, it's one of the least random games, like,
Yes. Yeah.
so, and you can always look to yourself after a duel match and say, what could I have done wrong differently? Whereas like maybe other games, I'm sure that applies to all games, but I think in particular in Quake, because it's so non-random,
Yes.
it's all about just advancing. I didn't really care too much who it was, to be honest. So
Okay.
I would say when Cooler said the whole like mid-tier thing and then I beat him, that was pretty cool.
Okay.
But
That's what got you worked. In that case, that's the problem. Rapha's too nice a guy, right? If he'd just talked shit on you and said, "Oh, I beat you the last 5 times."
well, it's also, it's not even like that. It's personal. It's just like, like you kind of deserve it in a way,
Yes.
because Cooler knows that I'm not. I think I'd beaten him before, like in tournament matches,
Sure.
like on LAN. So like, he probably doesn't even remember. So whatever.
Okay. When QuakeLive rather finished, and as I referenced earlier in the interview, it didn't really finish because if you know, first of all, anything about Quake players, they actually have the same mentality you described about Quake 2. There are a lot of Quake players who they aren't actually gamers. They just play Quake. And so whatever version of Quake they happen to play, that's what they do each day. They log on, they play Quake. If there's a lot of tournaments, you see them at a lot of tournaments. If there aren't, they just play sometimes for fun, or they play the odd tournament that there is, It's actually one of the most like loyal scenes I've ever seen because people just love the game. They're not thinking to themselves, as a lot of people in the modern esports world might think, and this obviously will be funny because we're going to lead into Overwatch. They're not thinking to themselves, what's the next hot game that's coming out? I'd sure like to try and make money playing it. They're thinking, is there a Quake game I can make money? Because otherwise I'm just going to play Quake not for money. So
Right.
towards the end of Quake, like I said, we still had the QuakeCon tournaments. We still had some tournaments you could play in, but it had really wound down. And at this point, most people are just playing either because if you're at Cypher and Rapha, maybe even if you didn't like Quake at that point, you still think, right, well, I'll at least like work my way back in a month before QuakeCon and I'll try and win that because actually that's a like pretty good return on your investment, of time that you've put in. Did you keep playing till the very end of QuakeLive? Did you care at all? It seemed like you disappeared from the tournament scene.
Yeah, the very end. So QuakeCon 2015, once that event was over, I was basically done with Quake until there was like a strong incentive to start playing it again from a tournament perspective. So QuakeCon 2016, I was focused on Overwatch, and I was thinking about attending QuakeCon, and I got like second place in like a North American tournament leading up to it. Of course, Rapha won that, and then but he was also in shape, and I wasn't at all.
Sure.
But was still enough to get second, and then I ended up not attending because of Overwatch duties, essentially.
Okay. Was it actually the case that, you said there, like, unless there was an incentive, you wouldn't necessarily play Quake, right? If Overwatch hadn't have come out, and no one actually ever knows if there's ever going to be future Quake games. We don't really, at least at that point in time, we didn't really have a relationship with the developer of our game. We just sat there and hoped they made us a new game at some point. So no one knew if there ever would be another Quake. Everyone thought maybe it's just QuakeLive with even more diminishing returns for years. Had you actually considered, I'm just no longer going to play any esports games, or I'm just not going to play multiplayer games, I'm just done with everything at this point in time?
Well, I had, I'm thinking back in like 2014, 2015, I'd heard about Overwatch coming on the horizon, and that had interested me just because like I still like have a hunger to compete, like it's not that, like I actually wouldn't be playing any games if there weren't any tournaments, and it's not about like financial return even. Well, it is, but it's more about like the glory behind it and the enjoyment from competing. So, but yeah, I did hear about Overwatch coming out for like a year or two. So that's kind of what I had my eye on, as I knew, QuakeLive was pretty much reaching its end.
Okay, so when Overwatch comes along, I realize, again, when people talk about Overwatch, right, I actually get a little bit tilted because people take the fact that it literally, on a terminology basis, is a first-person shooter, and they'd say, oh, it's an FPS game, and I'm like, more like a mobile with sort of FPS elements, Like, if you come from Quake or even Counter-Strike, it's very, very different. So what appealed to you about Overwatch? It doesn't really seem like something like if I say, I go back in time, hardcore Quake 2 playing DaHanG, this isn't a game, surely, that would tickle you, right? So what appealed to you about it? What did you like?
Well, again, when I'm thinking about like my mentality going into it, I wasn't even thinking about the game itself. I was thinking I still want to compete, and at my age, starting in like Counter-Strike or something is just a lost cause. So, and obviously I was going to stick with FPS. So, and I'm just not going the route of playing a game where there are already established pros with 10 plus years experience. So I viewed Overwatch as like a fresh start where people don't have an inherent advantage because they know a map that's 10 years old or they know the mechanics, blah, blah, blah. So that was basically the appeal. I guess I think part of your question is alluding to like the actual game though, like what I think of it. Yeah. It's good and bad. Was there anything
that hooked you in the early days? Was there anything good about it that was unique?
Nothing hooked me. I mean, it was fun to like play something new with like your friends I'm thinking like the original closed beta days. And you're like, there's so much to learn because it's brand new, so many heroes, etc. And I thought like the payload game type in particular was like, you know, a legit game type, made a lot of sense. There's an objective. It's not super random, like, and you could just think of all kinds of different compositions you can run. Like there was a lot of things that were kind of interesting about the game, even though it wasn't necessarily my first choice. But again, going back to it, it's really the fact that fresh start and there was supposed to be a big like tournament scene on the horizon.
Okay. So I have to say, I'll set this up just beyond not just the scope of just you, but when I saw Overwatch come out, and I saw in the very early days a bunch of these big name Quake players start to get involved, start to try and be pros. Obviously, coming from Quake myself a long time ago, I am a mad elitist. Like I always tell all the Counter-Strike players, like, yeah, you're pretty good at your game, you know, but listen, Quake's a way better. It's a lot harder game, you know. It's a lot more skill. Like, you know, they're the true best players of all time, you know. But I realise, you know, in other games, it doesn't mean that a Quake player would be amazing if he played Counter-Strike. That's obvious. Sure. You know, it's a different skill set. But I did die inside a little bit when I saw a lot of the names that I know as the legendary Quake duelers, and I saw the roles and the heroes that they played in Overwatch. I died inside a little bit, mate. Like when I saw that, like, Coola's a Lucio player, like, that hurts me. That hurts me on, like, a deep level, you know. When I saw that, like, again, Rapha, in no context, actually really considered, like, a star player, I'm like, what's going on? So when we come to you, DaHanG, and I see that, like, DaHanG is a support player and plays stuff like Mercy, I die inside a little bit. Like, why isn't DaHanG a Widowmaker player or a Soldier player? Like, why aren't you a DPS player and owning the game?
It was a very practical reason, actually. The reason was I was still working, like, full-time, like, over 40 hours a week. And I figured, you know, 6-on-6 Overwatch, you need support players. So, like, from a team composition perspective, it's not like you're just going to get carried with DPS players and you can have a shitty support player. So because there's a need, and particularly at the time, there wasn't even, I think it was basically Mercy and Zen as support, of course, other than Lucio, but there was no Ana, exactly. So it's like, I'm thinking about, you know, working full time and trying to manage that. Like, it just isn't a realistic goal to compete with these kids that are, you know, 16, 17 playing 100 hours a week, playing 10 different heroes on DPS. Like, I do have the background to maybe, like, you know, put up a little bit of a fight, but like in the end, like if I can't dedicate that kind of time, particularly I'm talking about like my intro to Overwatch, then it's just not worth it. So it's basically a practical reason, just support. And I'll just say it, like, support is easier to play, like, and it takes less time to because there are less heroes as well. So it's basically understanding, like, you still need to understand the meta just as well as anyone else, but that's picked up during scrims. It really doesn't, or the flow of the game, I would say, that's picked up during scrims. It has nothing to do with, like, oh, you play Genji, so you have a better understanding of how the game should be played, you know?
Okay. So when you start out, like you say, and like, this is a very good, very rational reason for why you would play support. Did it make it more fun though when Ana came out? Because this now seems like it's a support champion, but it is more of like an FPS element to it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I thought she was a great addition, especially because, you know, on the support side, again, the non-Lucio support players, because there's typically 2 on a given team of 6, you know, you're just stuck on Zen or Mercy. So, and again, I'm thinking back when Ana came out, because Sombra wasn't really a thing either, which is like a kind of a weird mix to the game. But yeah, I mean, so now we have 3 heroes that a non-Lucio support can play. So there's some more variety. And of course, then she was definitely like a high skill cap champion because, Overwatch players know, like, you get a lot of Mercy one tricks. I'm just thinking about, competitive queues, not necessarily tournaments, but you get a lot of Mercy one tricks that have huge SR ratings. But then they have like a 46% win rate. And they never play anything but Mercy, and they're playing in like the top tier competitive queues, and there's some frustration there. So Mercy is just, so much easier to play than Ana, and the addition of Ana brought a lot more, skill and a lot more. The peak of your skill could get a lot higher, and your contribution to the team with the addition of Ana.
Right, this is a pure hypothetical. I realize in the early days of Overwatch, yes, everyone knew it would have an esports component, but Overwatch League wasn't announced from day one, No one knew it would have as much as it has now. And definitely no one kind of knew when will that kick in, and when, things started out like a lot of esports do in the modern day. You start out, you have some online tournaments, then you have the first couple of LANs, and even that, that's the big organizers, they're putting their toe in the water, but they're not all going all in and announcing a whole circuit, So it's totally understandable why, at the time you're working, you don't just go, right, Overwatch is out, I'm quitting my job, I'm going all in, and this is my life, I've got to win in Overwatch. But in a world where you could go back in time, and now that there will be an Overwatch League, and that potentially this will be a big esport, and that you can make not just a good living, but you can maybe make a very good living, would you have just started from day one as a DPS?
That's a good question. The answer, like, if I was born in like 1998, the answer would be definitely yes. But because like I've, gone back to school and gotten like a graduate degree, and like I've got like a good career kind of, and the real like element that kind of made my decision pretty obvious, at least to get off Overwatch, was the fact that Quake Champions is coming out, and they're going to have huge tournaments. I mean, all these factors kind of made the decision a little more easy for me to go away from Overwatch. But like, would I have preferred to play DPS? Like, definitely. It's just like life circumstances in general, because of those other things I just mentioned just now, not just a lack of time, but like age, I think, is kind of a thing. But I'd love to have maybe, if we could just run that experiment, with a magic wand. Yeah. I definitely would love to have played DPS like that, especially coming from Quake, and the fact that they're just higher impact heroes on the game. Like, I don't think that needs to be, even mentioned. They have higher impact overall. They can kind of carry more. I would definitely like to have that role, but so. Definitely would have liked to have given it a shot based on different life circumstances.
Okay, so in the team that you were in Overwatch, TeamLiquid, one of the interesting things about this squads is, even though obviously you didn't have many big LAN placings, this is a squad where actually I did follow the lineup and the results from pretty early on, because when I looked at all the names in Overwatch, this is actually the team that has all the Quake players. You have AZK from CS, you have obviously ID, who you played with CTF with, you have rapha, you even had, funnily enough, people don't think of him as Quake player, but you had Dommy, who obviously we know from Quake, whereas, he's mainly known as Overwatch player now, obviously played for NRG later. So you had all like the actual names that came from the past game. So I was interested to see, like, this is an interesting mix, like, how will it work, will they have success in Overwatch? When you look generally, I know you made like a couple of roster moves. Are you underwhelmed by the overall results this team had?
A little bit. I mean, the way it kind of evolved, I kind of knew that the roster wasn't too crazy good for the game itself, in terms of like, all the players you're mentioning. Particularly, I'm talking about like 2016.
Sure.
But I kind of saw a light at the end of the tunnel based on like the roster changes that were being made. And I was actually like really optimistic, like, and liking the direction, particularly earlier in this year, because, there was like the Carbon Series event, and what was the other one? I'm trying to think here.
The winter premiere?
The winter premiere, yeah. So those we like had slow starts. Like I think we lost the first initial matches, but like we ended up getting stronger and stronger. I mean, it ended up being too little, too late, but like we actually did have very respectable showings on those tournaments as compared to maybe the 2016 results. And then even after, we had Overwatch Pit and Contender Season 0, where like we ended up getting second to Rogue, which was like, and pretty much this was still, I think, when they had their streak of just winning basically everything in North America. And you know, Contender Season 0, that was, you know, a legit, like, what, 500 plus teams signed up. It was just this open, you know, that's it. It's contenders. Anyone can sign up. And then we ended up, you know, finishing second. So, I mean, the direction the team was going based on the lineup changes and just the overall skill and performance of the team was really getting up there. Like, honestly, I remember, like, practice matches, you know, being toe-to-toe with Rogue sometimes not, you know, but... and Envious, like we were getting up there. Like we weren't there yet, but like we couldn't really be like scoffed at as this like second tier NA team. Like we were really, I was liking the direction we were going. But overall, I mean, I enjoyed my experience, but the question was like, was I underwhelmed? But I actually don't see it that way, because like I kind of knew what I was signing up for in 2016. Okay. So like obviously I want to win as much as possible, but you know, when you got a team like Envious, who's got 6 people in a team house, everyone's playing all day, every day, versus, you know, teams like the team I was on with Liquid, where some people are still working full-time jobs, you know, like if you're not, it's easier to be less underwhelmed when you know that the circumstances didn't allow for maximal performance.
Okay. When you made this team, as I referenced, we had a lot of players. First of all, a bunch of you obviously knew each other from Quake, and then AZK was in a very unique situation because obviously he's banned from CSGO, and so he came over and he started out with the game as a fresh start, right? From the outside, it looks as though the part of the reason you made the lineup is because these are a bunch of people you already know and you already have relationships with some of them, right? How much of it is that, like, you thought that I know these people from Quake, or I know that they would be decent players? And how much because I know, for example, that it's not like everyone was a free agent, you could go to anyone. Because, for example, actually, you go and look at the other big teams in NA, and they were mainly a similar thing. It was like people who played Team Fortress 2 together were like, right, well, we know each other, let's make a squad, you know. There wasn't a cliquish element to it. How did the actual lineup come about for TeamLiquid?
So, again, the difficulty of working the full-time job at the time meant, like, I can't just, like, go out there and, like, if you tell that to a team, like, hey, Envious, are you looking for a support player? Like, yeah, like, let's say they were. Yes. Yeah, I'm down to do it, but I work a full-time job. Like, you're instantly written off, right? And rightfully so. So this was, I think, like April, maybe May 2016. Like, think about where Overwatch was at that time. There's, like, online cups for $3,000, $10,000, and, like, 3 big events a year. Like, based on my circumstance, that didn't make sense to just grind Overwatch all day, every day. But what ended up happening was I saw like Dummy and AZK and Mezzer were looking for a support player. I think I might have seen like on Discord, like hearing some chat about it. And I said, okay, like I'm a support player. Let me give this a try out, you know, and it basically worked out. Like we were, you know, I was filling that void. And at the very beginning, you know, we weren't really, you know, necessarily doing too particularly well, but then I also knew like ID, you know, he was looking for a team. Obviously, I talked to ID pretty regularly, friend from Quake, so he was kind of like a natural fit a little bit later as well. So it was almost like looking for teams that could tolerate the fact that I'm working a full-time job more than like actual connections with like Dummy and AZK.
Okay, so you've referenced this multiple times now. Even when I gave you the hypothetical, you know, where you could have just started from day one and maybe made it as an Overwatch League top pro, you know, or something as some superstar DPS. Does the fact that you've done your school, you've got your qualifications, you've got a job, you just, unless it's some perfect that you don't want to give it up and become a full-time pro in esports, you want to do it just on the side still?
Well, the thing with Quake Champions, at least, like, I can actually justify that because I got so much Quake experience, and like Quake is different. Like you don't just play 8-10 hours of duels a day. Like all the Quake duelers kind of know that. even though other people don't necessarily know that. They think it's just like nonstop.
Sure. Well, maybe you can address that actually, because that's something actually, it's a good point, one I hadn't thought of, it's an abstract one. But people who play Quake and were the best Quake duelers of all time actually have never gone what I just call the Korean approach to gaming, which is you just play as many hours as you physically can, because the logic then is, well, at least I know I didn't ever slack off, sort of, you know. But in all the other games which have copied that, they don't seem to realize that in actually Quake specifically, what instead tended to happen was everyone based their practice first of all on when the big LAN is, like you kind of you want to peak for the LAN, and then secondly you don't want to play too much so you don't burn yourself out, right? You work it is kind of like you master each separate person how much you need to play to peak.
I don't I'm not 100% sure I know why Quake is like that. I think part of it is kind of burning out, and I think a lot of games you see the same scenario, and again, you could apply it to Quake, but I'm just thinking out loud. I think there would be a tendency if you're playing Quake and you've already played Quake for like 10 years. Like if you just keep grinding it and grinding it and grinding it, you might, I don't know if it's subconsciously, you might like kind of lose interest in some duels, and you might developing some bad habits, and start, just playing a little less disciplined. Like, I think that's basically what may happen. Like and speaking especially from my experience, if you're saying like, okay, a big LAN's coming up,
sure,
I want to practice 25 to 30 hours this week. I'm going to make sure that these 25 or 30 hours are real quality hours. I'm going to be playing every game like it's a tournament final. It's hard to kind of justify 60 hours of Quake playing every single game like it's a tournament final, because you don't really you don't do these experimentations in Quake. Like it's one-on-one. It's the same thing with armors and timings. It's not like you're trying out new champions, new heroes, new ultimate abilities, whatever the game is. So it's just, I think it's a matter of getting value out of the time you put in and not like getting undisciplined in the process.
What about, how would you contrast this to Overwatch? Because another aspect that I always thought, I think it's one of the reasons, by the way, why Quake as a casual game it's probably never going to be number one, is that to kind of like what you're saying here, when you play a duel, it's not actually really worth playing unless you're engaged mentally. You kind of got to be in the moment at all times, and you've got to be trying to play your best to make the best decisions. Whereas, listen, every other esports game has skill and strategy and all elements, but there are periods in other esports games, I think Overwatch must fit into this, where you have little bits of downtime every now and then, or you have a job that you're doing at this moment that's not the most intensive job, while sometimes you're thinking of what you're going to do next.
Right.
Quake, there's not really that element to the same degree.
Exactly.
Right?
It's nonstop, and every second matters, even if it looks like to the viewer that it doesn't matter. Like he's just waiting for 3 seconds for whatever reason. Like those seconds actually matter. Whereas in like Overwatch, there is clear downtime pretty frequently, and time to take a breather. Say, okay, what ultimates do they have? Like you're just talking. Like there are moments like that in between fights. So I think that plays a role in the fact that it's like nonstop action in Quake.
So when Quake Champions was announced, it was actually quite a while ago. And when first this announcement was made, I actually remember thinking to myself, because I remember, like I said, I followed the results of TeamLiquid, and I know that like at the LANs it didn't go that great, and online, obviously there was the teams that were very, very good, and then you guys were just below them. I remember thinking to myself when Quake got announced, I bet a bunch of these guys try and go and play it. And part of the reason why was because it just looked like in Overwatch it wasn't working out. So is there almost like a bittersweet element to the fact that, as you're saying, at the end, actually things looked like they were getting better and better, and then the lineup just killed itself, right?
Yeah, also, again, like at the end, things were getting better and better to very, very strong placements. Like it's not easy to get second place in back-to-back tournaments against Rogue and Immortals. Like that basically means we're right there, like basically, like, we're using that term loosely, but my plan was actually to continue pursuing Overwatch. And then I basically heard that Quake Champions wasn't going to just be the next Quake with a $50,000 tournament and at QuakeCon, like it was going to be $1 million tournament at QuakeCon, sure. And more was to come at 2018. So like, to me, it's just like, because there's going to be such a prestigious esport, at least that's the plan. And they will be, pushing it hard. That kind of made my decision a lot easier. Well, that in combination with TeamLiquid not getting a slot for Overwatch League was basically what made it kind of a no-brainer. But like as of July of this year, like I was still thinking that TeamLiquid will get us a slot in Overwatch, and I'm going to keep playing.
Sure.
So
okay, at this point, by the way, absolutely clarify and tell me if you can't say something on these matters or along those lines. I know from behind the scenes, basically until very recently, a lot of people didn't know if they were getting an Overwatch slot. And I'm talking about like big orgs. Like if someone knew some of these orgs that I'm talking about, they think, what are you talking about? That's like a legendary League of Legends org, or this is a legendary org from another game. And of course, or even worse, obviously a lot of fans might naively think, well, that team is at the top in Overwatch at the moment. So they think to themselves, well, of course their org will get it, which obviously, by the way, has no relevance. It's about business.
Right.
But I would have said from the outside, as just an outsider, well, obviously TeamLiquid will be involved because first of all, I know from the financing side, like the people who behind TeamLiquid do a very, very good job with the sponsorships and they can raise probably as much money as they want for any game. Then I know, for example, that they're actually one of the bigger multi-game orgs. They're in all the games, CS, League of Legends, Dota. They're in every game, basically. I would have thought this is a lock. Now, I will acknowledge if I then apply a bit of the naive logic myself. Yeah, they didn't have the best Overwatch team at the time. It's not like they had Rogue or Envious or whatever, but it seemed like a shoo-in. It seemed like surely this is going to happen. Now listen, maybe to be cynical, maybe that means you're not on the team and they get a whatever Koreans or whatever. That could have happened, Can you actually tell me anything? Why do you think TeamLiquid isn't an Overwatch League slot?
Well, first I want to say that I believe them and they are sincere that was their goal first, even up to the end in July, because in Contender Season 0, we signed a Korean player. We signed Internet Hulk as a coach, and we had Shatter 2K as well. We were all in a boot camp just for an online tournament. So and there was not going to be a big Overwatch LAN for at least another month or two. So that tells me that they were very, very serious. It doesn't make like any sense, like just practically, to sign a Korean, sign a brand, like, because we had to remove our prior coach, which really wasn't a problem. Aris, like, I think he was doing a good job for us. It's just that TeamLiquid heard that Internet Hulk was looking for a coaching position, and they felt like, collectively, we felt like we couldn't refuse Internet Hulk. So like up to the end, like we were all pretty convinced, and then I think, it just came down to money essentially. Like I'm not too privy to the conversations. I don't think necessarily anyone was rubbed the wrong way or any kind of weird drama or anything like that. It's just, the price tag and all the circumstances, I guess, didn't make business sense for TeamLiquid. So, they just chalk it up as, like, realistically kind of chalk it up as a loss because, they
made this investment at the end, yeah. Yeah,
exactly. Even like Rogue, that's a loss, I guess, in my opinion, for Rogue as an investment into the team. They spent that's 6 players and a coach and a trainer and whoever else they have on the staff regarding Overwatch. That's a lot of money. So, and they're not in the league as a unit, that is.
So with Quake Champions coming out, and not only do we have, obviously, at that point in time, people knew there was this $1 million tournament. Spread out, you don't win $1 million for first place for anyone who naively thinks so. You still win a lot of money for anyone who's played fucking Quake, where you used to have to try and beat Cooler and Rapha and Cypher, and then you get like $10,000, It's a bit of a jump up. So that alone, I can understand why it got a lot of people kind of like horning to play the game. Like some people were like, I'm going to go all in from day one. But obviously now we've also had a circuit announced. We've got the DreamHack events, and it's starting to build itself out. Did you do adequate preparation for the Quake World Championship? Like looking back now, obviously you don't have a limited time. You can't it's not like a movie where you can go for a training montage for a year, Did you get like what you would have considered in QuakeLive, like a proper set of preparation in and amount of games, etc.?
It was pretty close to the adequate amount. It's on the sacrifice side of things. It's kind of an issue is as a North American team, TeamLiquid, we were like pretty clearly the best team. And so we didn't really have the best competition. So it would have been great to have played some European competition right before to maybe, make ourselves better as a result. So that was lacking, but we couldn't really do anything about it, particularly because we were borrowing wins at the time.
Yes.
Who was still actively playing Overwatch. So there was just no chance of traveling and all that kind of stuff for a proper boot camp. So on that side, we did the best that we could. And then for duel, the only regret I made, which I don't, was the fact that I didn't abuse Sorlag, which, if for those that don't know, it's a champion in Quake Champions that, particularly at the time, was pretty much broken.
Yeah.
But the reason why I didn't do that is because I was told that the animation canceling on the ultimate, which, again, for those that don't know, Sorlag has a spit ability, and then you can fire like instantly. But that was supposed to be fixed, where you spit, you wait a second, then you can fire again. That was supposed to be the outcome by the time Quake Champions came in, but by the time QuakeCon came, and it was still pretty much broken. And I was banking on that patch.
You didn't want to invest too much time into playing it.
Because it's a CPM champion as well, yes. So I, there's a number of factors, but that's the one thing that honestly held me back, because everyone else was using Sorlag. It was so broken. And I was like, it's like the day of the tournament, and it was still not patched, because previously at the regionals, which you had to go to qualify for QuakeCon, they had a patch like the day before. So like it wasn't like I was like just hoping like some idiot or something like things are going to change. Like I was told it, they did a patch before regionals, so like I kind of had my game plan ready, but didn't turn out the way kind of hoped.
So when someone looks at the QuakeCon bracket, there were loads of famous Quake players that we know and names, etc. But I can't treat this like this is a normal QuakeLive tournament, because Quake Champions is quite crucially different. As you mentioned, for a start off, you're not just picking a different skin for your character. These are actually different heroes, and you're playing. Right. They have different abilities, and they have ultimates, and also the scoring system is very different. So in some ways, it's Quake, but it's also nothing like Quake that we've talked about in the rest of the interview. So how did you adapt to those elements of Quake Champions?
I mean, again, what I like is everybody has to adapt to them. So it's not like I'm coming in and people have 3 years experience playing this new style. Like since it's like a level playing field, in a sense, it's still Quake. So Quake players in general have an edge. But since everyone has to adapt, I feel like that might even help me more, because like, I've got, so much time under my belt and so much experience. And then even coming from Overwatch, you kind of have to think outside the box a little bit, and that's kind of what the new game type kind of makes you do, because you have to treat it differently with the ultimates in there. So adapting to it, I think actually probably helped me relative to other kind of players that might be Quake only and may not have my extensive background.
So in this tournament, obviously you still got a pretty good placing. You got top 4, and like I said, there were some classic players there. You played against Cooler in the 3rd place match, for example. You played against Vu, obviously, who went to the final. When you play against some of these players that you might have played in past versions of Quake, can you give me any sense of like how it's different to play them in Quake Champions? Like what's Cooler like in Quake Champions contrasted to QuakeLive?
Still feels like Cooler, like kind of like wants to kind of play the game at his pace, not really putting a ton of pressure on you. But trying to like set traps kind of, and he's just like, I don't want to say slower like mentally, but his style of play is less aggressive and more trap setting and pretty ABC like item timing style than others. And that's kind of what I noticed in Quake Champions as well. And same thing with Vu, like, he's got the CPM painkiller background, so he played the champions. So no surprises there. I mean, I think everyone, if they played, these opponents in the past, will still see and be able to say, okay, that's still definitely Cooler. He's not playing way differently than I would expect.
So obviously that is an element which is, I mean, when I contrasted it against when I said about Quake 4, where I felt like it was a bit more limited in how you had to play the game probably to be the champion of the tournament, I mean, outright from day one in Quake Champions, because literally the different champions move in a different way and have different, like for example, they mirrored the different versions of Quake, as he referenced when he said about CPM champion. Obviously you have the guy that looks like the Quake 3 champion. When you have all these elements, do you actually think that it's just early on that people are strong on certain things? Do you think in time, as a speculation obviously, will there be people who just stick to a certain style that for whatever reason that fits their skill set and they're just that type of a player? Will it be that sort of a game, do you think? Or will everyone just eventually be like, this is the strong thing, now we all try to do that?
I think it's going to be more that than anything. I think there's going to be like specialists like Gelisak and Vu that have a strong attachment to the CPM style heroes, but for just broadly speaking, it's going to be like, what's the flavor of the month? What's the strongest patch? Which champions are strongest right now? Because the movement system for the varying champions it's not as what's the word? Like clinical, I guess you could say. Like, I would say it's easier for me to just jump around on Anarchy, which is a CPM type champion, than to go actually and play CPMA and jump around. It's like an easier feel.
Streamlined it a bit.
Exactly. So it's going to be the flavor of the month. Who is strongest overall? That's going to be the approach to the game.
Even so, at the first duel tournament, you placed 4th. Right, that's sort of something that, if you'd heard earlier in the interview, that happened quite a lot in DaHanG's career. You said before, the story's not over with the finals and Cypher and rapha, etc. Are you someone where, are you going all out on Quake Champions? Are you going, is being number one and trying to win a massive tournament, is that at the forefront?
That's my mentality, yes, but I'm still working part-time. So like on paper, I guess you can't say 100% all out, but I also, I don't feel like that's even holding me back necessarily, because it's just a little more structure, stay on a good sleeping schedule, stay disciplined, etc. But yeah, I mean, I would be pretty damn disappointed if I didn't win a big Quake Champions event, and that's the goal. But I'm also focused pretty heavily on Sacrifice too. I really want to, kind of there's been a lot of it's been a lot of talk that like NA can't keep up with EU and stuff, and I'm just thinking like, if you look back the last like 6-7 years at the last several QuakeCons, it was NA like almost every time actually. So want to make sure NA's back on top in that respect too. So I'm kind of going all out for both, you could say.
Okay, right. At the end of the interview, do you have a final message or someone you want to thank or say hello to?
No, actually, I would just want to say thank you for the interview, and I actually hope that you can do a little more coverage, like in general, of Quake. I appreciate it as a Quake player when I see an interview with Wins, for example. I'm really hoping Quake Champions picks up. There are some issues with the game in terms of like smoothness and things like that right now that will be patched. There's gonna be like a big push next year, so I'm really hoping the game picks up and people can find a newfound love in Quake Champions, and I hope it grows as an esport. And thanks again for the interview.
Hey, this is Huck. If you want to watch this top 3 asshole keep doing esports content, subscribe to Thorin's YouTube channel.